Thank you everyone for joining our panel on Guarding Finances, the Power of Transaction Monitoring in AML and Financial Crime Defense. I'm joined by our colleagues, James, Andrew, and Cara. Andrew, did you want to introduce yourself first?
Yeah, thanks, Dylan, and thanks to Chartis for organising this session. One of the things that I often start these sessions with is someone I've been in this particular industry since the mid-90s, and way back in the mid-90s, the UN estimated that the amount of money that's laundered through the global financial system is 2 to 5% of global GDP. Fast forward sort of 30 years, and that estimate is still about the same. So we can use transaction monitoring to be more effective in mitigating that risk. So, as I mentioned, my name's Andrew Davies. I'm the Global Head of Regulatory Affairs on the vendor side for a company called Comply Advantage, and we provide data and technology to help manage financial crime risk.
Cara, did you want to introduce yourself next as well?
Absolutely, and I wanted to thank you for inviting me to be on this panel with luminaries in the financial crimes, anti-financial crimes industry like Jim and Andrew. And Andrew, what a great introduction, kind of putting everything in perspective for us and how important this work is. I manage a team of folks that own the models that detect suspicious activity at Truist. And I feel like I have the coolest job in the world because I work with really exciting technology that's trying to solve a really important problem, which is keeping our financial system safe from bad actors. So I'm thrilled to be here, and thanks.
And Jim, do you want to introduce yourself to our panel?
Yes, thank you. Good morning. My name is Jim Rugeriis, and while these days I'm in the global sanctions and anti-boycott space, I have spent about 20 years in the transaction monitoring niche of financial crimes compliance. I'd like to thank Chartis for the opportunity to speak today. I find these panels very invigorating, and I feel that our industry is changing. We're getting a lot of new people coming in, and well, they don't know where we've been. So I find these panels an excellent way to help educate and bring the less experienced analysts and managers up, help them with their careers.
Yeah, completely agree, and I think that's why we at Chartis are expanding our outreach to the market around financial crime and providing this programming. So the concentration of today's panel is around the power and capacity of transaction monitoring to address AML and other kinds of financial crime related issues. To just kind of kick off this panel, we wanted to concentrate on an initial question of how does one define transaction monitoring? What is transaction monitoring at its core? Is it a technology, a set of business processes, or both? And what does transaction monitoring refer to? And I wanted to hand this question to you, Jim, to kick off.
Thank you, Dylan. Many times people will consider transaction monitoring such as the old rules that we had and more of the standard, let's look at a series of transactions, that is customer behaviors, whether it's a DDA or some other type of product, and aggregate that behavior or those transactions over time and look for indicators that we have determined would be a sign of financial crime. But we need to expand that. We need to consider transaction monitoring as our customer monitoring, our vendor monitoring, looking at overall behaviors and activities that may not necessarily be financial based, right? It could be something where, yes, it's ATM checking deposit, or it could be a checking of a cashing of a check at a particular branch, and what branch that has that, where's that geography of that branch concerning where the customer normally lives and works, right? It's looking at larger sets of data and looking at the behavior of the customers to identify what we have as possible indicators of financial crime. And those indicators are where this whole process would start. Looking at how our products and services from a bank's perspective could be leveraged for furthering the proceeds of crime into, through, or out of the financial system. And whether or not those behaviors can be detected through our data sets, right? We need to look at what we're trying to find before we look at what data is available to us. With the current focus on terrible crimes like human trafficking and obviously pig butchering, which has been in the news. It may not be enough we may not have enough data to properly identify those indicators. And so it's a question of a give and take, right? The transaction monitoring in its essence is how to prevent or at least detect and further prevent further intrusion into the bank by bad actors. So if we're saying that we don't have the data, then we may need to work with the business to acquire more data or different data or look at data differently. So I think we just need to expand our historical perspective on transaction monitoring and look at it as not just a technology process, but a combination of the front end data acquisitions, the storage and manipulation of data, the analytics that search or filter that data, and our analysts, our resources that will review potential indicators of whatever it is we're looking for, we'll call it financial crime in general, to make determinations for further investigation. And then those in-depth cases. So really, it's a chain of both human processes, business processes, and technology components.
Yes, and that makes sense. As you know, we're hearing in the market, sometimes professionals are confusing transaction monitoring for just the underlying systems, but you're absolutely right that it is a collection of human and technological processes that exist to detect AML and other financial crimes. Given that transaction monitoring is comprised of both human and technological approaches, Cara, I wanted to first ask you, how do you think we should be approaching the balance of using advanced technology to detect financial crimes with also the need for human oversight and intelligence to augment and operate these processes?
That's an excellent question, Dylan. And let me start by kind of referring back to some of the great points that Jim just made about it being a chain of processes linked together. And I think the kind of the connection between technology and human can be summed up in the management of the risk. Because in each element of that chain, and even in the connecting of the different processes, there's risk. And so and there's risk in using the tools. So the humans are the ones that have to figure out how to manage these tools, despite having a really complex process that's trying to do something really hard, which is detect criminal activity that is designed to be not detectable, and to manage the risk of tools that are imperfect. So in my world, I deal a lot with compliance and governance, and model governance in particular. And one of the basic tenets of model risk guidance that we receive from the regulatory agencies through a document called SR 11.7. One of the central principles of that guidance is that models are never perfect. And so we as humans need to understand that our models are never perfect and how to manage the risk of using these imperfect tools. But in addition, as Jim pointed out, we have to also kind of figure out as humans, what is it that we want to monitor in the first place? And these tools are only going to do what we tell them to do. So humans really can't be taken out of the equation. Not yet, anyway.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And so if humans can't be taken out of the equation, what proportion do you all think is actually being automated versus manual at present?
That's another great question. And I don't know that I have that answer in particular, but based on conversations I've had with folks in the industry, it could be less than 50% of SARs are actually detected by the automated transaction monitoring systems, is one kind of number that's been thrown out there. So even when with companies with exceptional, really fancy and effective transaction monitoring systems, we're still heavily reliant on our bankers and our first line folks to be detecting the suspicious activity.
So, sorry, could you repeat that number? Was that 1% of alerts are
No.
tagged?
Sorry. When we think about SARs, and this is a very unofficial number, But when we think about like overall SARs that get sent to FinCEN, one number that I've heard thrown around is that less than 50% of those SARs were generated by an alert from an automated transaction system. That is still that a lot of the SARs that eventually go to FinCEN were first discovered through bankers and first line folks raising their hand and calling something as suspicious.
Yeah, and
So
I can jump in there.
fixes
So one of the things on the vendor side is you get to work with a lot of different financial institutions, and I think it's optimistic to say it's 50%. I think it's probably significantly lower than that. The ratio of alerts to cases to SARs that are generated by the automated monitoring systems. As a vendor, I'm often speaking to financial institutions, and one of the things that they immediately ask for in their transaction monitoring system, which is a whole sort of, and this is from a technology perspective, and that takes the life cycle of alert to case to SAR, for example, and then to management reporting. They always ask for, oh, can we automatically create a case? And one of the reasons for that, and often they'll ask for some sort of front end for frontline people to actually originate a case investigation for the compliance team, because they're seeing things that are being missed by the transaction monitoring. So I think it's sort of a really important point to make, that there is that, and I think Jim and Cara have both talked about it, that symbiosis between the sort of spidey sense, as I call it, of the analysts and of the frontline resources. Remember, you work for a bank, you work for a regulated financial institution, you get AML training. So you've got that sort of built into how you're going about your business all day, right? And, I want us to try and uncover this financial crime. And I think that's sort of important to understand, that often the origination of suspicious activity comes from the front line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if I could add. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Andrew, you are correct, right? The front line, the tellers, the RMs, the people that are dealing with customers, the face-to-face, are critical in the prevention of financial crime. But we separate those processes, right? A lot of banks will call them an unusual activity referral or a frontline referral. And that would be an input into a case. The same way that the transaction monitoring rules could generate alerts, and those alerts could be adjudicated, and that would be an input into a case. There are many case initializers, right? Government inquiries, negative news, all sorts of things. But I'm focusing on the transaction monitoring side, right? It's also important for compliance to understand the business and to understand the potential vulnerabilities of the products based on the controls of the front line. So not only do we like to talk to the tellers to educate them and make sure it's like, keep an eye aware of this, but also to see how people are using the products, right? What do they think are potential abuses of the products, right? Everyone has an input and it has a value when they're working in the financial institution. They have different perspectives, and we like to collect all of that information to help us better understand what is the risk associated with a particular product or branch or any kind of portfolio. So, excellent point. Just wanted to sort of expand a little further.
And that's actually very topical, because our next question for starting, would love to hear your thoughts, Andrew, are sort of how is the shifting kind of product and business environment affecting transaction monitoring at present? What are you seeing in the business and product landscape that is impacting transaction monitoring technology and the approaches that are needed to effectively detect and remediate financial crime?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things here, and I just want to sort of, there's a great statistic from the European Central Bank about false positive rates for alerts for suspicious activity derived from technology right now. So 99% false positives here. So we have to keep sort of bear that in mind. And then, of course, we're going through, as you sort of sort of mentioned a transformation in financial services. So one of the things that we are seeing, and this is why it's important to understand Jim's concept, right? We have to keep our eye on the risks that we're trying to manage. And I talk about 3 dimensions of risk: compliance obligations, reputational risk, and then support with a moral imperative. Jim mentioned human trafficking. There are 50 million people that right now are subject to human slavery around the world. The proceeds of that activity is laundered through the system. And look at the landscape that we've gone through. So, 2024 is sort of mentioned to be the year of open banking in the United States. We've had open banking in Europe. We have fintechs offering gateways to the financial system. So we live in that world where the financial system itself is transforming and has a broader ecosystem. People can access their financial wherewithal through fintechs. Of course, money in the world that we live in today moves more quickly, and it moves in different ways. It can go cross-border using things like cryptocurrency transactions that require no intermediary financial institution. So money moves much more quickly. I think when the FedNow was introduced in the middle of 2023, there were 35 banks participating. Now there's 300. Money moves around the world instantaneously. So given that money is moving more quickly, the ecosystem is more broad. And of course, regulatory oversight is continuing to evolve to keep pace with the changes in the system. We have to look at the risks in the context of the financial system that we're seeing today. Now, one other thing that I'll mention there is criminals are aware of this disruption in the financial system, and certainly their activity is in part a function of the disruption of the system. They will take advantage of that. So we have to have tools and processes and people that are savvy given this sort of transformation of financial services. So technology has to move more quickly. If you think about fraud, and I do have a doomsday scenario about sort of institutional transactions going cross-border that could have a material impact on the financial system itself. So technology has to manage the risks in the context of those financial services. Now, just a slight sort of U-turn on that. Remember, this transformation of financial services is good for the consumer. So I think something that Jim mentioned earlier, he used the term give and take. So we want to make sure that we balance any friction that we introduce with the effective management of the risk that we see. And just to give you some context, one of the things that we do at Comply is we produce an annual survey of 600 C-level execs in the financial crime space on a global basis. And if you think about that idea of real-time payments, 99% of the respondents to that survey said they will be or are currently participating in a real-time payment infrastructure. So these are all good things. They're things that we have to offer to our customers, both commercially and on the retail side. We just need to manage risk in the context of that transformation. And then if you think about the fintechs, this broader ecosystem I see as, it's only as strong as the weakest link in the ecosystem. So fintechs need to adopt the same type of technology and have the same sort of super smart analysts that the banks have.
Yes, absolutely agree that we are seeing a lot of challenges in the fintech space currently, especially with the some of the recent consent orders that have been released. Switching paradigm slightly. I know, Cara, you're mentioning that sort of underlying system logics and other approaches might also benefit kind of addressing these emerging business threats. Did you want to talk about that for a bit?
Yeah, so the one thing that makes our job really hard is that we have to simultaneously be looking in the future and identifying these constantly changing and evolving risks, including new payment methods, as Andrew was rightly pointing out, but at the same time, keeping our eye on the ball with the existing risk for existing payments. So in the National Money Laundering Risk Assessment report that came out recently from OFAC, cash is still king when it comes to money laundering. And that's because in some ways it has an advantage over these new payment methodologies because cash is anonymous, stable, and widely accepted, whereas these new payments, have the anonymity pieces not as much as an advantage. So yeah, so what banks have to do is keep their eye on all the cash and at the same time develop the right rules and detection methodologies to stay on top of the new ways that money's moving around the world. And it's a tough job.
So speaking of how money is moving around the world, our next question wanted to cover how is transaction monitoring actually applied in the wild? I wanted to ask all of you as sort of practitioners, is transaction monitoring helping you to identify financial crime, or merely and I should say technology, are these systems merely accelerating existing business processes? Help the audience understand how to approach transaction monitoring through a anecdote or example that you can pull out of your experience. And James, I really want to get your thoughts on this first.
Oh, thank you. I don't want people to think of transaction monitoring as technology-based for these large systems, whether they're cloud-based or whatever. It could be something as simple as an Excel spreadsheet. There are still many institutions that will take banking reports from their core and process them as a method of transaction monitoring. Some larger institutions will have certain departments that may take a subset of data that they use for other purposes and repurpose that in Excel or Access or other desktop tools in order to monitor the transactions. The important part, I think, is really to look at the fact that these aren't static processes. You can't just, and I'll use Ronco's term, set it and forget it. You need to implement part of model governance and part of the actual transaction monitoring a life cycle that would include an evaluation of the performance of the rules. And I'd like to use the performance as far as actionable alerts, not necessarily SARs, because it's a little different. You can have a high quality alert and it not contribute to a regulatory report, but it could be combined with others that would have a development to a case. So I'd like to consider the rules or the configuration of the change in behavior detector as one of the resources, a member of the team, and subject to performance monitoring, the same way that our analysts and managers are. And that performance monitoring may be annual or other time-based, or it could be trigger-based, right? The performance falls below a certain amount, right? Oh, well, this rule hasn't generated any alerts. We should turn it off. Not necessarily, right? The techniques that criminals use to launder funds ebb and flow. They come up with new ones all the time, but there are still old techniques still in use today. So I don't always like to turn off a rule per se, but adjust it, tune it, have a continual process of improvement where we're looking at how is that rule functioning? How is it performing as far as a measurement of actionable alerts that come from it? And maybe we need to change the frequency. We want to reduce the noise. Andrew's probably right. There's less than 1% of system-generated alerts that result in an SAR. But it's still important to catch that 1%. Mm-hmm. So if we can reduce the noise, we can improve the efficiency. And everyone knows compliance is the cost center to these banks, So we want to be more of a team player and be more efficient, have reduced cost, and help protect the brand, the bank, the brand, the financial institution.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, did you want to jump in as well? As I knew you had a great example from your past experience that we discussed previously.
Yeah, absolutely. I can talk about that, and I concur with everything that Jim said. The starting point is always the risk, and then the technology is a mere part of the team. It's a critical part of the team, though, and if you think about the growth in financial transactions, I think according to ACI, there's sort of close to 200 billion real-time payments sent around the world every year, and that's increasing by about 50% every year. Now, we could have an army of people that could review every transaction, and that assuming that they're doing their job properly, you could basically stop all financial crime. Of course, we don't live in a world where that's possible with that volume of transactions. I'll give you an example where transaction monitoring technology uncovered I was with a financial institution, and one of the analysts And the people who work in this space are super inspiring, right? That's why it's great to be on with Jim and Cara, who are practitioners. But the analysts, they take pride in detecting financial crime because ultimately they're supporting that moral imperative. They're doing the right thing. So I'll give you an example. I was at a financial institution in New York. I was talking to the chief risk officer. We were having a sort of nice chat about technology and people and processes and the symbiosis between technology and their human expertise. Knock on the door, someone comes in and says, hey, we just found a high value international transaction that's clearly fraud. We're just taking a look at it now. So there's obviously an international payment going from the US to Southeast Asia. When they actually do their due diligence, they find that the recipient of that payment is actually linked to terrorist financing in Indonesia. So this was actually taking the proceeds of criminal activity, putting it into a DDA account and then wiring that money out. So it was an anomaly because it was the first time that this customer had actually conducted this behavior. So it looked like fraud. Someone's been subject to account takeover. And remember, and I think we were sort of alluding to this earlier on, when we talk about transaction monitoring, we're actually looking at different types of events that could be beyond transactions. It could be some unusual login or changing credentials that can actually sort of feed the monitoring technology. So someone looks at this, looks like account takeover. When they actually have that sort of overlay of that spidey sense, as I call it, from the analysts, they basically figure out that actually it's linked to another risk that we're trying to mitigate. So that's where so the anomaly detection system, great. It showed us an anomaly that ultimately led to a suspicious activity report being filed. But the starting point originated by the transaction monitoring was a different type of criminal activity than actually what what the investigation found the incident to be related to. So it starts with potential fraud, ends up being money laundering, and then even worse, the funding of terrorism. So sort of great example of how that symbiosis works.
Yeah, that is a very fascinating example, and appreciate both of your thoughts on the realities of practicing transaction monitoring. Lastly, I wanted to sort of leave the audience with your final thoughts around how is technology changing AML transaction monitoring? What do you think is going to continue to stay the same, and what do you think will change given the ever-shifting business and risk environment? And can systems evolve to actually address the concerns that you all have raised around issues such as model inaccuracy and the ability of humans to, or the need for humans to triage actual crime activity? And Andrew, I'd appreciate if you could introduce some of your thoughts.
Yeah, so the technology the technology has to evolve. Criminals are using technology themselves, and they don't have to worry about CFPB, compliance obligations. They're singularly focused on committing their crime. As long as we keep our eye on what Jim mentioned earlier, keep our eye on the risk, and then leverage the power of technology, human capital, and then something that Cara will think about, keep our eye on the fact that we have more data now, right? Every human, every second is generating on average around 1.7 megabytes of data. Right, so we need to get the right data to mitigate the risks that Jim mentioned, and then if we do that, the technology, the expertise, the programs will evolve to allow us to achieve the moral imperative. And I just want to come back to that idea of that Jim mentioned, human trafficking. Right, if you stop money laundering, this is from the FATF, stop money laundering, save lives. That's why we need to make sure technology, data, and the whole processes continue to evolve.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Jim, did you want to provide your thoughts next?
Yes. I am an early adopter of technology, always have been. And something like machine learning, large language model can be very useful in the adjudication of alerts. But I don't think we're going to get to a point where the various AI tools would be able to replace our investigators, right? I think there are tools to help. There are tools to reduce the time to collect data. There are tools to have certain known conditions that are not suspicious, right? So let's say, for example, we're doing due diligence on a wire. It's a lot of money for sugar going to a construction company. And the analyst is like, why on earth would a construction company need sugar in the Middle East? Well, it turns out it's part of the concrete curing process. It is one way to help curing a hazard. So there was a business explanation behind the use of those products, but it took time to do that research, right? Something like machine learning could help, right? We did put together a knowledge base, but something like machine learning could help identify the acceptable business conditions, the non-suspicious or the non-unusual, to reduce the noise. But it's not something that in my mind will ever replace a good investigator.
So I believe we're at time. Cara, did you want to leave us with a very brief thought, and then I will hand us off to the next panel?
Sure. I'll just say that how we think about using the tools in our investigations is really important. And the things that while the tools will change and evolve, one thing will never change. These computer-based systems will always be imperfect. And as we use them in our business strategy, we own the risk. And that's a good thing, because if we own the risk, we'll do the actions necessary to mitigate that risk. And those actions will result in a safer financial system.
Absolutely. Well, agree with everyone that there is a lot to sort out still. There are many intricacies to the transaction monitoring space, and really appreciate all of your time and expertise. Thanks everyone for listening. Please be sure to tune into our next talk. Thank you.